Welcome to Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn.
Hello, welcome to this week's Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn Spotlight session. I'm Sarah Harte, Planning and Communications Strategist with Haven Horizons. Today I'm in conversation with Susan McKay about DSGBV media reporting guidelines, which is a topic we are focusing on in this spring series of Lunch and Learn. Susan McKay is the Irish Press Ombudsperson and the first woman to hold that role. Also the first Dairy Girl. We love Dairy Girl, Susan. She's an independent decision maker on press complaints, upholding the freedom of the press while balancing that with the public's right to hold the press accountable. She's a very well-known author, commentator and journalist. Her first book, Sophia's Story, was published in 1998 and is now out of print, although I think it was printed twice subsequently. She wrote this first book in close cooperation with Sophia, who determined that the book would help other victims of child abuse to become survivors. They have remained friends to this day. Susan's other books include Northern Protestants and Unsettled People, Northern Protestants on Shifting Ground, and Bear in Mind These Dead. She also wrote, Without Fear, 25 years of the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, having worked as a volunteer in the centre from 79 to 81. Born in Derry, she went to Trinity College Dublin in 1975 and returned to the North in 1981. She was a founder member of the Belfast Rape Crisis Centre and worked there full-time until 1984 when she moved to Sligo to run a centre for young unemployed people. She later worked as a community worker along the Fermanagh border before training to be a journalist at DCU. She has written for many, many publications specialising in social issues and the North. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Irish Times and The Guardian, and has been widely anthologized. She has continued to write extensively about violence against women. From 2009 to 2012, she was the CEO of the National Women's Council of Ireland. So Susan, I think what stands out there from your bio is not just a very long and varied career, but is that the fact that you straddle three different areas, broadly speaking. You've written extensively about violence against women, so we'll say the DGSV field. You have a long career as a journalist, and you've also written a lot of non-fiction. This really, it seems to me, gives you a very wide lens on a topic like media reporting guidelines. What's your take on the importance or not of DBSGV media reporting guidelines?
I think that what's really, really important is that there has to be dialogue between journalists, between media professionals and victims and survivors of gender-based violence of all kinds, because I think that it's an area that has been sort of neglected for so long in Irish society, North and South, that people don't know enough about it. And it is an area that's surrounded by myths. And, you know, of course, organisations like the Rape Crisis Centres and Women's Aid and other organisations like that have done a huge amount to educate the public, but there's a huge amount more to be done. And I think that there's immense goodwill among journalists about this issue, but there also is a great need for training and education. And I think that those are the most prominent needs. I think guidelines can be really good, but they mustn't be too prescriptive, because when they're too prescriptive, it sets up a conflict between journalists and victims and survivors, which isn't helpful. I think that what's important is the conversation and the dialogue. But I do think there's a lot of value in guidelines which are broad and which are drawing attention to things that it mightn't occur to journalists to think about. I did some guidelines for victims and survivors of the conflict in the North in relation to their experience of the conflict and conflict-related violence. And it was, you know, I did a set of guidelines it was for Queen's University, and I did it by way of some guidelines for journalists, but also some guidelines for victims and survivors in their dealings with journalists. And I think that's an important area to look at, because, for example, a lot of people feel that they can't say no if they're asked by a journalist to do an interview about something when in fact they can. And sometimes it's better for them if they do say no, if they're feeling vulnerable and they're not certain how this is going to go. So I think what's important about those guidelines is that they've got sort of broad guidance in them, like just a straightforward, simple one that people mightn't think of. If you're a journalist, you're often tempted, if you meet someone who's been through a very traumatic experience, you're often tempted to ask them to tell you all about it. And very often people will do that. They'll recount a horrendously traumatic experience that they have had, and it will probably be quite upsetting and potentially traumatic for them to do that, to repeat it like that. Now, that's all fine if you're doing a long interview with the person, if you're writing a major feature about what they're telling you about. But quite often journalists do that when they're just going to be writing a very, very short news report in which they will possibly use 2 lines out of that interview. So I think guidelines should address questions like that.
Kind of.
Yeah, just don't put people through things that you don't need to put them through. If you're talking to someone who's a victim of a crime which has been widely reported, there's no need for you to ask them to repeat everything. Make sure you target your questions to what you need to know for what you're doing in particular, and make sure the person knows that. Other things would be things like not giving people expectations you can't live up to. Like, don't tell them that you're going to be able to come back to them and let them read the article before it's published if you know that you're not. That's an aspiration that people have, but it's not necessarily one they can live up to. So I think a lot of common sense is required with guidelines, but I do know that they annoy editors.
We might actually come back to that point about say the mandatory voluntary thing. You covered quite a lot there. We have the notion of how the guidelines should look, mandatory, voluntary, that relationship between the media and victims. You've talked about journalists and trauma. You also, at the very beginning of your answer, you mentioned how a lot of journalists, there's a lot of goodwill there, but you did mention the notion of myths. And I noticed, so myths and stereotypes in a way. And I noticed that in 2024, you were speaking in Bristol, and I'm going to just quote from you. You spoke about a graphic kind of journalism that thinks it knows the story before it investigates, and that, quote, finds it hard to relinquish the stereotypes even when it knows better. So could you just say what you mean about that, or expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's one of the greatest sources of learning for me about this whole area was working with Sophia McKay on the book Sophia's Story, which came out in 1998. And I had attended the trial of Sophia's father, who was convicted of very, very serious child violence, sexual abuse of every kind on Sophia and some of her siblings. And the book was written, we worked very closely together in writing the book. And she said to me, I don't want this book to be titillating for any child abusers, and it wouldn't have occurred to me before she said that was true, that, you would get the sort of men who hate women, the sort of men who think it's okay for them to rape children might actually find it really quite pleasing to read about what Joseph McColgan did to his children. So that hadn't occurred to me. But one of the other things that she talked about was she was saying that she got really concerned and upset when people would say to her and her siblings, why didn't your mother protect you? Why didn't their mother protect them? Why didn't she look after them? Why did she sit and watch all this happening? And Sophia said, and I'll never forget what she actually said, which was, our mother couldn't protect us. Our mother was one of us. And it was so important because that is a very strong feature of many cases of child abuse in families, where in fact the mother is also a victim of the man's violence as well, whether through domestic or sexual abuse or both. But
isn't that in a way kind of, when in our field we talk all the time about myths. We were actually talking about it at last week's session about how culturally powerful domestic violence myths are, those myths. And one of those key ones, which you've just alluded to there, I think, is the one, if it was so bad, why didn't she stay? A variant on that is, why didn't she protect her children?
Yes, and why didn't she say, of course, stay, of course, is something that is, all of these things are used in court cases by barristers for defendants to try to undermine the story that is told by the person who is the victim. And it's all the more important, therefore, that journalists and writers do highlight the actual reasons why women keep going back.
That
It
was
is
really
well,
updated.
because it is well documented that they keep going back, and there are many very strong reasons for that, including the fact that they've nowhere to go. You know, I've always felt it's important when you're writing about these kind of stories to include some cultural information, you know, like at the time that such and such a woman was being abused, the local refuge in wherever it was had no spaces and hadn't had any spaces for several years, you know, because it was so overcrowded. Or in the case of Sophia McColgan, there wasn't a rape crisis centre up in Sligo or Leitrim, and there were no services that were targeted in particular at a sort of feminist perspective of what violence against women was. So she ended up actually being counselled by Limerick Rape Crisis Centre, and it was a lifesaver for her because finally she was talking to somebody who understood her perspective on what was happening.
It's interesting you say that about the cultural context, and again, in terms of guidelines, not every journalist would be as switched on as you about that. I read an article that you wrote about the Belfast rugby trial. Needless to say, all the defendants were found not guilty in that trial. I'd just like to say that. But an interesting thing to talk about cultural context, the wider lens of the story that you mentioned, I think, in the article was about the fact that the victim at the time, there was no Belfast Rape Crisis Centre. I think that was true. And the victim went looking for one and there was none. Now, you'd obviously been a founding member there, but that cultural context, I think, is very important. And we would say that when we're analysing stories written about domestic violence or domestic homicide, one of the big things we would say is that it's not just about, understandably, the journalist paints the story and gives context about who the victim is, who the perpetrator is, what the circumstances were. But that broader context about contextualizing the statistics and why this isn't a once-off case, but is part of a broader pattern is very important. So just to move on there.
Well, if I can just say one more thing in relation to those stereotypes and things that you very helpfully showed the cover of Sophia's story earlier, and that photograph that is on the cover is actually really important because Sophia insisted upon that we would have a photograph of her smiling and that triumphant, and that picture was actually taken of her emerging from the courtroom after she had had her father convicted and sent to prison for something like 200 and something years, of which he only served 8. But anyway, it was the longest service that had ever, it was the longest sentence that had ever been given for those kind of crimes. But the publisher was contemplating using one of those photographs of a little child huddled in a corner with their face on their knees, you know, in a picture of despair. And Sophia said, no, that was not what she wanted. You know, that the story that she wanted told was going to be that she was a survivor and that other people could be as well, you know.
That's interesting because in last week's Spotlight session, Madeline and I were in conversation and we specifically honed in on how a story is presented. And one of the bits that we were looking at, apart from headlines, which are very important, and the narrative, obviously, was the notion of images. And we actually were referencing, Madeline was showing us loads and loads of different images. She was showing us images from Jane Gilmore, who has this project called Fix It. And a lot of the images are, you know, a fist or someone cowering in the corner. And, you know, we were just talking about how that can be unfortunate in terms of the signals that it sends. So what I was going to ask you about there was, you've kind of referenced this in the first part of your answer, but we'll go back to it. We'll come back to it now. So obviously Articles 17 and 18 of the Istanbul Convention, essentially when you boil them down, what they're saying is 17 is broadly speaking kind of, you know, acknowledging the big role that the media have in shaping norms and perceptions and basically in educating the public. And 18 then speaks to training. Do you think that training is something that should be introduced for journalists? And if that was the case, how would that, what might that look like?
Yeah, I think training is incredibly important. And one of the things that I learned when I was doing the guidelines for victims and survivors of the conflict in the North was that journalism schools are not really doing very much, it seems, for the most part, in the way of training of this kind. You know, they're not bringing people in to talk to students about how they might think about approaching social issues in general, and particularly traumatic issues like this. And I think that that's something to campaign for. I think that journalism training should include that. But I also think there's a lot of room for, I think a lot of organisations now do provide really good training, which they can deliver to newsrooms as well as to journalism students. And I think that's really important. I mean, the key thing is listening to women who have had these experiences and listening really carefully, not assuming, as we've already been discussing, that you know what the story is, but actually listening to the things that she says, you know, are the things that are still troubling her, on the points that she wants to get across. I think one of the sort of phenomena of our time, and I think Sophia may have been one of the sort of first people who did this, was the thing of waiving your anonymity in order to tell your story. I think we underestimate that sometimes, how much that takes out of a person. You know, like, it's a huge thing to put yourself into the public domain, and it has become even more challenging now than it was back in the 1990s, because nowadays, if you look at the sort of comments that are made on social media after a woman comes out and tells her story, they're appalling. And every myth, every piece of hatred against women is thrown at them. Now, that's not done, generally speaking, in the Irish media. And I don't think certainly any publication that's in the Press Council would publish something like that, because, you know, we do have, I just recently published this handbook, which is a handbook on using the Press Council's Code of Practice. And there are quite a number of principles in here which could be applied to situations of violence against women and bad reporting. But we still rely on those women bravely coming out and telling their stories, knowing that there will be people out there who will be judgmental, who won't be sympathetic, you know, but they're doing it because they're doing it as a public service. And I just wonder about that sometimes, that maybe we're asking a lot of people, you know, that is this really the only way that we can educate the public about these things? Should we not be doing much more about educating people privately? And certainly when I first got involved in rape crisis work, which was way back in the late 1970s, there was no training going on, and there was a lot of resistance to training, not among journalists, but among others. And ultimately, the judges, I think, might have been the last to accept that they needed training. But I think that kind of training does now go on and has been very, very helpful in terms of how crimes are perceived. And how, I mean, it's important that judges should know and should be recognise when the myths of rape are being thrown out towards the end of rape cases. You mentioned the past trial, and that was, of course, very important, because those guys were found not guilty and that verdict stands. But there was so much else that was disquieting about what unfolded in that courtroom, and it was important that journalists were able to capture that. And I think a lot of journalists did capture a lot of the sort of sense that, you know, there was stuff that
a lot of unanswered questions
needed exposed, a lot of unanswered questions, and a lot of cultural information that needed to be examined.
Yeah, and I think just on the training thing, I mean, we're not really talking about training for the legal profession, but while the training for the legal profession for judges is beginning, it's very much in its incipient stages, and training doesn't really exist, is the reality for most barristers and solicitors, which is an absolutely huge problem. And just wanted to say to you, without getting into all the other countries or jurisdictions that have media reporting guidelines and DSGBV, there's quite a few, because Madeline has been researching that. Do you think, is there any particular reason, like this is 2026, why we haven't got there yet, or do you have any perspective on that?
I'm aware that there are some guidelines in the north, which were written by journalists who have personal experience of gender-based violence. So I don't know, but I think that it's something that should be done carefully and with a lot of thought, for the fact that, and I think the involvement of journalists and survivors in helping to draft those guidelines would be very, very important, because, you know, I noted that Mary Crilly and Dola had joined the meeting, and they do fantastic work in a Fixed It campaign of, you know, sort of showing headlines that they find offensive, or descriptions in articles about violence against women which they find offensive. But on the other hand, I know a lot of journalists who would say, but you know, people don't understand enough about the constraints that we operate under. And that is also true. You know, for example, a journalist in court can get into incredible trouble if they describe a crime using their description of it rather than the legal title for that crime. And some of the legal titles for crimes are quite Victorian in their assumptions, and they don't adequately reflect our current way of regarding certain crimes, particularly, for example, crimes of sexual violence against children. So I think that the need is there to sort of, the campaign perhaps needs to be to get those laws modernised and to get their titles changed so that they do reflect reality. But I don't think often the journalists aren't to blame. And I think some journalists have done a lot of good work on trying to sort of reflect both the need to describe the thing as it's described in law, but also to indicate that there are other ways of looking at what has actually been described. I know, for example, I was once covering a murder trial of a woman, and the evidence was given in court. The evidence which was given in court was incredibly disturbing and graphic, of the injuries that the woman had sustained. And I wrote about it in the Sunday Tribune, and I summarised it as being her injuries were horrendous. And I went back to the trial the following day because it wasn't completed yet, and the judge was contemplating collapsing the trial because I had used language that hadn't been used in court. You know,
yeah. So it's
extremely dangerous for journalists to use language that isn't contained within the constraints of the court, and victims and survivors and the groups that represent them and campaigners need to be aware of that and need to be sympathetic to the situation in which journalists are working. I do think guidelines are important. I think that they need to be helpful guidelines that will enable good reporting rather than trying to sort of stamp out something that people find offensive. So I think that mandatory type guidelines, it needs to be something particularly significant if it's going to be argued for as a mandatory principle. I think that for the most part, they should be helpful to journalists, but also very strongly be rooted in the voices of victims and survivors, because it is pretty bad that you hear people still talking about how the coverage. We had the Press Council and the Press Ombudsman's Office had a seminar last year about the law and violence against women and the Press Ombudsman's Office. And, you know, there was a woman there who was talking about how the coverage of her case, she felt, was almost as bad as what had happened to her in the first place. And that's terrible. That shouldn't be happening. We definitely need to be listening better.
Yeah, well, I think you covered there a lot again. I would really agree with you there about survivors' voice being important and not re-traumatizing people through coverage, but also the reality, as you know, is the realities of busy newsrooms, busy editors, busy journalists. And, you know, any guidelines, in my view anyway, and I'm going to hand you over now to Madeline, but should not be mandatory, because journalists, you know, it's all about giving helpful guidelines that people can use. Journalists have enough to be dealing with defamation law, and you've just pointed out, you know, extremely strict strictures that they're subject to when they're reporting in court. So with that, I am going to hand over.
Could I just say one more thing, Sarah, before we hand over to Madeline and the Q&A session? I think it's really, really important that if people think that media coverage is bad of these subjects, make complaints to the Press Ombudsman's Office. Like, I can't initiate complaints. Sometimes people think that I should be taking up complaints myself. I can't do that. My job is to respond to complaints from the public. So if you are annoyed, angry, upset, or whatever about coverage of an issue like violence against women, please make complaints. There is scope within the Code of Practice of the Press Council. There's guidance in the handbook, which I showed you earlier and which I have referred to. You know, make complaints. You can change the way that the media cover issues by using the Office of the Press Ombudsman in that way.
Okay, thanks very much, Susan. Thank you for that. So I'm going to hand you over to Madeline McAleer, our CEO now, who's going to look after the Q&A.
Hi, Madeline.
Hello, Susan. Thank you so much for that. You touched on so many points there, and we will be following up on the nuances. What came up for me, which I hadn't really thought about, was the need to educate frontline services on the what journalists can and can't do. And I think that's really important. That might be really useful in terms of people feeling very frustrated with the media. And also, I think it's great you're uniquely positioned to have the background in domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, in journalism, and now in the Press Council. So I think that has been really, really useful. I suppose to say as well that Haven Horizons is a small organisation that's set up to focus on prevention, really public awareness, education, changing those cultural norms and the myths. So this is really an important element of that. And I think there is a huge challenge because we're all members of the public. Some of us are working in particular areas and have different viewpoints. But I think that idea that coercively controlling behavior in an intimate relationship and the high risk of homicide associated with it compared to the risk of incidents of physical violence, those sort of things are so important that if journalists had that sort of background information, as you said, to be able to write the story maybe in a slightly different way, and at that time then they'd be dispelling those myths, and they'd be linking that power and control in an intimate relationship with the public, the systemic and structural power and control that allows it to happen in the first place. So I think we really, and your point there very much, that the guidelines would be useful and not mandatory, I think. And we will be having a working group set up at the end to look at what is the best way. So all of those points are going to be really useful. So thank you so much for agreeing to come and do this. It was powerful. Just before I go to the question and answer, I'm just going to tell you those speakers that I've been talking about that are coming up. And so our next speaker, again, is uniquely placed. It's Christine Doherty. She is a working journalist, and she's at the moment a doctoral student in Maynooth. And her research is looking at the challenges of reporting on DSGB in Ireland. And she's taking some case studies and doing that. The following week, we have Luke Harte. And Luke, I think some people might be aware, his mother and sister were murdered by his father, Lance. And he has become an activist, and him and his brother Ryan have written books. And in a huge part, he said the reason why he became an activist was how the media covered the case. And you'll hear him, he's a fantastic speaker on this issue, so well worth listening to him. And then following that, we've Professor Susan Leahy from UL, and she's written guidance for print media reporting on sexual violence. And then Sonia McMullen, who actually wrote the Responsible Reporting Matters Northern Ireland. So they did that in conjunction with journalists. So that's what Susan was referring to there. So then after that, we will be setting up a working group. And just to say that we did record all the lunch and learns that we've done, and this one will be recorded. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and do follow us on our socials if you want to keep updated with what we're doing.
Thank you for watching.